Welcome, everyone, once again to the American Mind podcast. I'm your host this week, back from the Lincoln Fellowship, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. I'm joined by Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and director of publications here at the Claremont Institute, which means he gets to straddle the world of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books and keep us all rowing in the same direction. Another one-on-one episode today. Mike Sabo is out for the week. We wanted to start with this interesting for our purposes, interview of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, on the topic of woke one, as she calls it. She was asked whether she was troubled by Francesca Hong, the gubernatorial candidate in Wisconsin's stances on things, including Hong's expressed position that Thanksgiving ought to be canceled. Hong expressed this back in 2020-ish. And so it led AOC to say, I have a former city councilman friend who says, woke one was crazy, wasn't it? And this is AOC's way of waving away, if not the last 6 years, at least what she deems to be some of the excesses of 2020. Don't take Hong too seriously. For that matter, don't take El Sayed too seriously. The senatorial candidate in Michigan. He's got some past positions, among other things, about thinking American football is toxic masculinity, or perhaps Mackinac Island, this place up in northern Michigan. For those who've been there, an idol of sort of small town Americana, but a place that struck El Sayed as too white. It's interesting to see the Democrats starting to take this tack and wave away 2020 and the intersection of COVID and George Floyd as a bit of rhetorical excess. And the conceit here is obvious, and the deceit here is obvious, which is that everyone should just forget about those years, not take any of our rhetoric seriously. Can't we all just move on? We have great things to tackle in current day America, and we didn't really mean all of it all that much. This has led to some ink being spilled since, mostly on the right, or maybe the center right. Peace and Unheard, among other places, said that AOC cannot just wave away woke one. The proper way to view that, and it's the consequences of 2020 and the ways in which our institutions have been radicalized since then and continue to be radicalized since then, means that this tactic ought not to work, and places like ABC and others should not tolerate it or let people like AOC get away with it. Just as a little coda, AOC is also in the news over the last couple of days because she filmed herself at 37 with a longtime romantic partner, that kind of red-haired white dude, I think he is, who's been her boyfriend for the better part of a decade. She's now announcing to the world that she is freezing her eggs, and filmed herself going through the injection hormone process. This led Ben Shapiro, among others, to say that this means she's running for president because she will be able to claim that she's putting aside family life for another, it will be another at least 6 years, so that she can faithfully serve the country. I don't know whether that's what's going on here. AOC has this habit of trying to connect with her audience and with her political fans by doing radically personal videos. So I think this could easily just be another piece of that drama. But it's odd to say nothing more of it. But we want to return to this more important point, which is the Democrats have a real problem. It's a coalitional problem now for them. The right has their own coalitional problems, but the left has theirs as well. And it's an interesting tactic to try to calm everyone that the latest effusions of left-wing populism, and perhaps these former statements of said left-wing populists, whether it's Mamdani or Francesca Hong in Wisconsin, or perhaps El Sayed in Michigan, that really they're about the serious business of competent governance now and the uplift of the lower and working and middle classes along somewhat Democratic Socialist lines. And we need not pay too much attention to what looks like their deeply held race communist convictions. Spencer, what do you make of this latest tactic? And you think it's going to catch on, or it will fail utterly?
Well, it is all unfolding exactly as I predicted. I never make predictions anymore because I'm always afraid of being wrong, but I did lay this down on the line when Trump got elected a second time. And mostly through this podcast, I've been carrying on my obsessive narrative about the Piker pill, the Hassan Piker pill, that left-wing populism is ugly and demented. It's also what's on the menu. And there was bound to be a period of time during which the Democrats turned inward and reflected on all the things they may have done wrong that led to this staggering defeat, this rousing upheaval that brought Donald Trump back into the White House, despite their many, many efforts to shame and discredit and exile him. And that took the form of floating moderation. We're going to talk about abundance now. We're going to get rid of all the crazies, and we're really just going to recenter the working class, and we're going to make it more about kind of bread and butter, kitchen table issues. And all that stuff, as I said at the time, was admirable and in some ways a reasonable response, but also doomed because we're living through this populist moment, and the left-wing flavor of it that has caught on has the character of woke. And so now they're stuck with this double bind where they can't give up woke as they wish to. They wish to cut woke off entirely and just cast it aside like so much dead weight. They can't do that because they're committed to it. But we've seen what woke looks like in 2020. And when it is let loose, it turns everything into crap. And so people remember that, and they've had to walk back some of the more insane things they said. After Kamala Harris's failure, the New York Times, very delicately began to run all these pieces, reconsidering whether maybe muzzling children and cutting off their genitals might be sort of an ill-advised thing and generally kind of unpopular. But again, this is what they've got, and this is where the energy is. And so now woke is taking a new form. It's taking a new form coalitionally. And the shape that has is, it used to be woke one. If there was a woke one, it was the Black trans woman at the top of the grievance hierarchy. And woke two is the dispossessed Palestinian at the top of the grievance hierarchy. And that has some consequences for the way this coalition is going to be organized. But fundamentally, the logic of it is going to be the same, which is that there is a structural, essential wrongness to Western civilization and to America as the premier exponent of Western civilization, and it needs to be totally reworked so that these marginal figures are moved to the center of life, and all of our ideas are going to be kind of reworked around it. And so how do you make that pitch to the American people while prizing it apart from the misery they all lived through in 2020 and 2021 and 2022? Well, it's this new idea. Well, that was woke one, right? There's so many things about this that are funny to me in a bleak kind of way. One is that, of course, woke one implies a woke two, right? And it's been pointed out that AOC at no point says, here are the things about woke one that I now reject. She does, as you say, Ryan, present it all as a cosmetic update. It's like there were some issues in the way we pursued this, and maybe we went too far in certain domains, but, and this is the second part of it, we really all agree on these basic principles. And there was a lot of healthy and good conversation that took place in the wake of George Floyd. For example, this is the example she gives. For example, we all agree that there should be a lower crime rate, right? And so when we were talking about abolish the police, that was just our way of pursuing that shared goal that we all have, which is that we all think there should be less crime. No, we freaking don't. That was precisely a point of contention during what AOC is calling woke one, a central premise of which was crime should be legal. And even now, people are still saying things like no human is illegal, which if you translate it actually means, I think you should be able to break the border laws all over the country without getting enforced. I think that there should be limitless illegal immigration. So there very much was not and is not any kind of agreement between the woke and the non-woke about whether there should be a lower crime rate. It's not just a logistical dispute we're having about policy and how to bring this stuff about. Woke people actually think that many, many fundamental laws of this country should be reversed so that there is more of what we now call crime, and that maybe they want to make it legal so it's not crime anymore, or maybe they just want to abolish ICE and stop prosecuting crimes so that the crimes go on without getting punished. But either way, like, this is a fiction that AOC is putting forward. And I do think the fiction, to answer your question, Ryan, about whether this is going to work, it is a transparent fiction. And obviously everybody has written about how there's no substance to this. And in fact, the thing that she's defending, this woman, Hong, who has come out with all of these past statements, the things that she's talking about are bananas and insane. And this is a person who wants to, reduce her proximity to whiteness, I think, and cancel Thanksgiving, as you point out, and all of these unpopular things. And AOC wants to be like, well, she had those positions now, but she's changed as in the new era of like woke 2. But much as Kamala Harris found it impossible to come up with one single thing that she wanted to do differently from Joe Biden, even as she presented herself as this brand new day and moving forward and not going back, these guys that want to offer themselves as the new version of wokeness don't have anything that they can say or point to that makes them different from woke 1. And so I don't think it's going to fool anybody exactly. And I still think that this rearranged, reshuffled wokeness is unappealing to people. It doesn't really make that big of a difference if you put a wheelchair-bound, paraplegic, multiracial, transgender person at the front of your poster versus if you say, actually, what we're in favor of is Hamas and the wretched of the earth. Those are both equally ugly, but one of them is new and therefore might kind of pull some people in, and also it's playing to this genuine dissatisfaction people have with the economy, some of which I think Trump's second term has contributed to, and some of which is just part of the general populist movement that we're going through. So there is one way in which woke 2 may be meaningfully and strategically different from woke 1 and more effective, which is that it is more economically focused. The grievance and the resentment and the scapegoating is directed more precisely at the super rich. And the solutions being proposed to wealth inequality are all equally bananas and counterproductive and will result in disaster. And if we go that route in 2026 and 2028, we will find out really quickly that woke 2 has many of the same ugly consequences. But it is honed as a messaging strategy. And I think that is important, that the woke 2 is zeroing in on the thing that people are actually upset about. And there's a sliver of reality to that. And it includes like the tariffs haven't gone all that well. The Iran war is kind of dragging on and raising gas prices and stuff. And I think like that part of it may be more strategically effective to all of our detriment. It would be a disaster if that's true. I'm still not convinced that it's gonna be a winning strategy because it's still got a lot of problems and there's a lot of time between now and the next presidential race. But I do think woke 2 is more dangerous and more laser targeted on things that people actually care about. What about you, Ryan? I mean, do you think this is going to work?
It's a pretty clever attempt, I suppose, at splitting the baby of their coalitional problem. The joke, not really a joke, but the thing I was telling the Lincoln Fellows last week was, given the unpopularity of the Iran war and continuing inflation, which took off during the Biden years for a variety of reasons, and we should say that they had some political, economic, and policy roots even in the Trump's response to COVID, or at least the legislature under Trump's response to COVID. All of these giant debt-fueled handouts to deal with COVID in the first year and a half, and then the continuing sort of bailout economics of the Biden years have started. So they sort of started under Trump. They were supercharged under Biden, and they continue into this administration, and they're exacerbated a bit by tariffs and now fuel prices and the Iran war. All of this is fueling discontent across the political spectrum. The correlation is not causation, but somebody plotted Trump's approval rating, and Trump won, and now in Trump 2, and it tracks pretty well with the price of gasoline. So that is not lost on people on either the political left or the political right. And what I was saying to the Lincoln fellows is, thank God that Bill Galston and Josh Shapiro are not running Democratic Party strategy, because we'd be in much worse trouble, both in the midterms and I think going into 2028. So this, I think, is their version of, this is the best they can do so far in a kind of triangulation that happened during the Clinton years that Bill Galston was at the center of. For those that don't know Galston, he writes for the Wall Street Journal. He's kind of their center-left opinion page, voice of moderation and reason. Recently, just as one example, he said about the Trump administration causing a bunch of stink about and holding hearings over their counterparts in the legislature, holding hearings about the Smithsonian's American history treatment in Washington, D.C. Galston wrote an article last week or the week before saying, well, Trump's not all wrong about the Smithsonian's problems. So Galston is registering some sympathetic allegiance with the rejection by a good portion of the country, and including the Trump administration, of this kind of identity-obsessed view on American history, the notion that we've always been a racist, imperialist, sexist power, and the manipulation of the historical story of America to serve woke one, if not woke two. The point of my comment to the Lincoln fellows is, thank God he's not in the driver's seat. We'd be in trouble. But this is interesting to me because it looks like whatever's happening behind the scenes, AOC and others see the problem, and their version of dealing with it is to wave away woke one. We'll have a couple of data points about how effective this will be. The continuing Mamdani reaction in New York, as his policies will, I predict, and we predict, exacerbate a lot of the economic problems in New York rather than deal with them. El Sayed in the Michigan Senate race, is he going to be able to prevail in this new, as you put it, the grievance hierarchy? Sayed represents the Palestinians at the top of that grievance hierarchy. Is he going to be able to prevail against Mike Rogers, who's already running videos appealing to Democrats and trying to chart a kind of centrist path for himself against this radical? And then finally, the 2028 primary for the Democrats. What's it going to look like? One last data point in that regard, and I, as often is the case, some of my talking points come to me the night before the podcast from my wife. She's a big fan. She's a big fan of Mark Halperin's very interesting and sophisticated podcast and vidcast. And Halperin has now put Josh Shapiro at the top of the Democratic frontrunners for prospective frontrunners for 2028, which seemed to me and also to Mrs. Williams to be somewhat absurd, given the fact that Shapiro is Jewish, and we just are very skeptical that the Democratic Party's coalition, in some of its durable left-wing populist characteristics in recent years, is going to be able to swallow a Jewish candidate at the head of its ticket. I still think, for now anyway, Kamala Harris is the front runner. Newsom's going to have his own problems. So we'll have a bunch of tests of this proposition. In the meantime, we can watch to see how effective the rhetorical shift is and how much people are swallowing it. But there's a lot going on there, and it's a savvy move by AOC. And I suspect she's not alone. This is behind the scenes being workshopped for sure. AOC is a kind of savvy political animal, at least in her embrace of new media and the way she uses it. And she's certainly ambitious. She's not probably as intellectually gifted as some of her competitors, although Kamala comma does not stand in that genre. But yeah, the whole thing's pretty interesting. It will be, I would say, fun to watch, but these are very serious times, and the fate of the republic hinges on the coming years. So it's not fun, but it's an interesting tack.
If we could retire to Aruba and watch from afar, it would be interesting and fun, but it's instead just going to be interesting and nail-biting. Yeah, the kids online, if you are not one of them, our listeners should know that there is this online meme, the secret third thing, where it's like, I'm not liberal, I'm not conservative, I'm a secret third thing. And here on the American Mind podcast, we have a secret fourth host, and that's Amelia Williams, your wife. So she is our secret invisible contributor who makes a lot of the great points that we talk about. But yeah, I think this is very much a puzzler for the Democrats. I don't want to understate the difficulty of their position. I do think that Trump 2.0 has left them several openings that you alluded to. And more broadly, there is a thing going on in the country that does transcend right and left and is a secret third thing. And that is this moment of radical change, desire for radical change. And it speaks to something actually that you and I, Ryan, have discussed in our Extra Plus segments, which if you are not a Plus subscriber, you should go to claremontinstitute.substack.com and get our extra deep dives, because we did this really fascinating series of episodes on the oral arguments for, I believe it was Trump v. Slaughter. It was the court case about executive power and the bureaucracy and whether the president can fire bureaucrats at will. And in that set of oral arguments, Sonia Sotomayor had a really telling line of questioning for Trump's lawyer, which was basically, how can you ask us to upend the way that we've been doing government for the last 50 years? Meaning, you're proposing that this is a more sound constitutional understanding of the executive branch, that he is unilaterally in charge of those institutions and bodies that carry out his instructions. You're proposing that that's what the Constitution says. But I'm telling you that in order to get back to that constitutional understanding, you have to flip the chessboard over and basically undo this entrenched system that we've been living with for much of living memory. And I think what's so interesting is that Sotomayor is correct about that. It's not that that means we should have decided Trump v. Slaughter differently, but it does mean that she's describing truly the fact that in many areas of American law, even if you are, like us, a kind of oh shucks constitutionalist who really thinks that the American idea is the right way to do America and wants to live out and enact the founders' plan, that is a radical proposal. That is a proposal that requires radical change that will be shocking and disturbing and will cause a lot of turbulence, as we've seen in some of the better moves that Trump 2.0 has made. And one thing that means is that basically all the propositions on the table, the serious, viable political propositions, are acts of radical upheaval. Some of them look more to us like radical restoration, and some of them look like radical destruction. But they all entail flipping the chessboard over. They all involve this really extreme set of changes. And for that reason, our moment is one in which systematic, structural, root-deep actions just have a lot of appeal. My account of that is that the kinds of actions we actually do need are radical in the sense of going back to our roots, but it's very easy in such a moment to propose other radical solutions that will be more disastrous, like tax the rich into oblivion, like get rid of capitalism, like abolish ICE or abolish private property, or any of these things that are now gaining in currency. So I think that people like AOC and Mamdani and so forth have a rhetorical advantage in that playing field. They're not the only ones with a rhetorical advantage. Trump also has an advantage, clearly, and so do right-wing forms of populism and so forth. But the AOCs of the world are in some ways ascendant because they have the Mamdani type edge, of like people want, young people especially, just want something big to happen. And I think that, as you've said, Ryan, the experiment in the DSA's version of something big in New York will probably produce misery. And Republicans would do well to watch that carefully and figure out how to use it and point to it as an example of what happens if you go with this stuff. Because, yeah, we are going to get, much as in the Civil War, we got a little preview of what industrialized warfare looked like that we should have paid attention to. In Zoran Mamdani's New York, we're going to get a little preview of what Woke 2.0 looks like if it's in charge. And hopefully, like, the Republicans will pay attention and effectively use it to show why Woke 2.0 is not going to be any better than Woke 1.0. But that might be too much to ask. I don't know.
It will be hard because the evolution from political economy to identity politics, in the academy has roots going back to the 60s and 70s, and then the efflorescence of it perhaps in the 90s with political correctness. We've talked about this before, this thing that looked like a weird campus phenomenon in the 90s has now spilled out over into the public at large in the 2020s, fueled by this particular incident of George Floyd's death. And, we've been over that ground many, many times, but the ability of the left to just switch back to political economy, I think will be seen, will be very difficult. And however much they'd like to try to emphasize the switch back to socialism or communism, the race part of race communism is still in the driver's seat in many ways. In fact, many of the political economy arguments at their root are still arguments about inequities and oppressors and oppressed. So it's the evolution away from what has now been a 30-year trend, at least, if not a 50-year trend, will offer a lot of opportunities to Republicans to throw some cold water on this attempt or to expose it for the fraud that it is. Now, that presumes that the average or even the elite lawmaker or public rhetorician on the right has a notion of this evolution and the changing nature of the American left or the left and the West. And unfortunately, I think the number of people who really understand the ideological and political currents over recent decades on the left is pretty low. But I guess it falls on us and others like us and the savvier of the interpreters of our current moment on the right or even on the center right or even the center to bring this to the fore and to hang it around the necks of the politicians who want to just wave away Woke 1 in order to serve their pursuit of political power in Woke 2. More on that as we continue to observe it. We have a very relevant next topic, given what we've said about
actually
this.
Dovetails right on into the next thing we're going to talk about,
which is this Atlantic piece by Tyler Austin Harper, now a full-time Atlantic writer, but starting in 2019, right out of graduate school. He was an expert in sort of ecological humanities, as they call the topic, but interested in literature from the 20th and 19th centuries and its intersection with ecology and environmentalism. He ended up getting a tenure track job at Bates College right out of his dissertation program. Tyler Austin Harper is a self-described light-skinned Black American. He writes this piece for The Atlantic called Why I Quit the Tenure Track, The Insufferable Hypocrisy of Elite Academia. It has so many gems in it because it's his description of his disillusionment with Bates, one of these many liberal arts colleges that was founded by abolitionists in the 19th century. They dot the landscape, both left and right. Just as a few examples, Bates is one of them. It's in Lewiston, Maine, one of these declining or now long declined American industrial towns, industrial revolution towns, now kind of hollowed out working class, mostly white working class, it being in Maine, has been on hard times in recent decades, just like many other places. Another mirror image example actually is my alma mater, Hillsdale College, founded by Free Will Baptists who were abolitionists before the Civil War, with many of the same desires for academia, or at least for higher education or liberal arts education at the time. Bates, Hillsdale. Another one is Oberlin, again, now on the left. So there are lots of these liberal arts institutions that were founded to kind of realize and educate an America that they wanted to be colorblind and post-slavery. And they're all still around, and they're, at least in the case of Hillsdale, doing things very, very differently than Bates or Oberlin. So Tyler Austin Harper goes to Bates. He gets hired right before COVID hits. He sneaks in 2019, and he goes there optimistically. You know, he's going to a storied institution, again, founded by abolitionists, a serious liberal arts college where it has this idyllic, 100+ acre campus, beautiful place, a charmed place. He can't believe he and his wife's luck in moving into a beautiful home with wild blackberries growing, nice neighbors, academic neighbors who are very friendly. But he begins to, especially compared with their previous rent in a big city America, they're renting this beautiful old house for half the price of their rent prior to that. So he thinks he's won the lottery. And he acknowledges throughout the piece that he comes to the bigger realization. He acknowledged that throughout his career, part of the reason he was lucky is because he ticks an identity politics box, and he was the beneficiary of some mild form of affirmative action, he acknowledges in the piece. But then is appalled over the next few years as he witnesses Bates's normal liberalism, the weird kind of race-obsessed liberalism of the faculty, and he comes to realize that he really is a token black at the college as a professor, and he begins the beginning of his realization is at his indignation at being chosen as the chair of the committee to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s anniversary birthday. And when he gets the first email request, he thinks to himself, are you effing kidding me? Because as he puts it, the last time he spent any time with Martin Luther King Jr. in a scholarly way was in high school. He's done a very different academic thing since then, and he has really no business or expertise doing this. But of course he says yes, because he can understand why Bates would want to put one of their black professors at the head of this. So okay. And then I think the beginning of the end is identified in the piece, where post 2020 Bates wants to embark on this system-wide reevaluation of curriculum and the integration into all majors of a couple of race-inflected required courses. That is, all majors, including mathematics for social justice and chemistry for social justice, to embed anti-racism in all of its curriculum. And this strikes Mr. Harper as ridiculous. And I just want to read a quote. I said the subhead of the article is the insufferable hypocrisy of elite academia, and the hypocrisy he's talking about, he expresses here. So the document that he's going to reference right now is this plan to bring in some outside consultants to have every department audit the extent to which it's racist, and then to help the dean put together this grand plan to reform Bates. And as Harper puts it, it's titillating. The prospect of being the first liberal arts college to require of every major a couple of courses in anti-racism is just too attractive for the faculty. But the whole thing, he says, struck me as an Orwellian masterpiece, the document for this plan. By turns insane and sinister, the only thing that gave me solace was the certainty that the proposal was so self-evidently unhinged that it would never get past the rest of the faculty. All of this social justice rhetoric also felt wildly hypocritical. The same October day that the dean promised to abolish retardants to progress, including classism, adjunct faculty and staff announced that they were starting a union drive, citing low pay and poor working conditions at the college. The union was intended to be wall-to-wall, meaning that it would include non-tenure track faculty but also people working in facilities, the dining hall, and other non-academic roles on campus. The administration's skullduggery started almost immediately. Just over a week after the unionization push became public, the student newspaper took down an article about it from its website when a college spokesperson requested that it do so, citing inaccuracies. Shortly thereafter, a new version of the story appeared with talking points and edits suggested by said spokesperson. The college declared that it would not remain neutral during the unionization drive, and by November, Bates had hired the same consulting firm that was helping Amazon crush labor organizing on Staten Island. I began to develop a case of political vertigo. There I was, joining my colleagues and sifting through our curriculum like anti-racist truffle pigs, assigning an Afro-Caribbean graphic novel, Marshallese eco-poetry, and the like to diversify my syllabi, and organizing a decolonization and liberation-themed MLK Day celebration meant to honor a civil rights leader who had been assassinated while supporting sanitation workers agitating for basic labor rights. Meanwhile, the college was paying ungodly sums to corporate mercenaries to ensure that it could continue exploiting its most vulnerable employees. But if administrators felt the least bit sheepish about their hypocrisy, they didn't show it. So we don't need to swallow whole his sort of rah-rah unionism on the Bates side. But this was a bridge too far for Mr. Harper. And, about a year later, he'd go on to give up his tenure-track job in academia, a thing he once considered a dream job, to go write for The Atlantic and go into think piece journalism rather than to suffer this stifling and hypocritical approach to higher education, which again echoes quite nicely our topic from our last segment. How the different weights being placed on the left to political economy and identity. At least in the Bates case, Mr. Harper observed that they were going to continue to embrace wholeheartedly the identity politics part of it, and to operate as bloodless and mercenary crushers of anything that would affect the bottom line while they pursued their identity politics.
Yeah, this one is just kind of funny. I mean, since Harper has escaped, and since we don't teach at Bates, we can watch this and remember those times with a certain degree of schadenfreude, I think, as these nincompoops and buffoons flail and defeat themselves. Although, of course, there are some things to be serious about. I mean, many, many wonderful, wonderful moments in this essay, which, among other things, is just as has been observed, is a masterpiece of craft. A real master class in how to structure a large think piece like this. But I think there's a feeling that some right-wing readers might have, which is, we've been saying this forever, right? I've seen a little bit of this in the response to the piece. Like, if only somebody had told you at the time that this whole worldview was bunk and doomed from the jump. If only somebody had said this was bound to go down in flames, And I understand why people feel that way, but I actually think this is something that leftists have to tell each other from within if we're gonna resolve this in a healthy way. Actually, is that at some point the intellectual elite, which include a lot of left-wingers, we must concede, right? There are many very sharp leftists out there. They're going to have to kind of speak up internally to one another about how bad this stuff has gotten and how much it needs to go. So I think that Tyler Austin Harper is very brave for being one of those people, and I think that he is an effective messenger of this revelation or this news, even if some of us have been like banging this drum for a long time. An example of that actually is his running commentary about the disconnect between class justice and race justice. Because, as you say, Ryan, his priors and his expectations about what constitutes virtue and justice in the economic domain are not ours. We don't share with him the enthusiasm for union striking and so forth. But because he sincerely and rigorously believes in that kind of economic solidarity, he's able to say with sincerity and authenticity that it's completely at odds with this other confected, lab-cooked racial grievance hierarchy, which is very, very often a way of distracting from economic oppressions, as he would describe it. I mean, one of the most strong, I think, through lines in the piece is wokeness was presented as the discovery of a necessity that people had come up with, the realization that justice demanded this thing on its own terms, simply because it was just. And of course, in fact, wokeness, especially in the academy, was really, as much as anything, a reaction to other crises that were going on, some of them self-inflicted. For example, he points out the pre-woke moment on the left that gained the most traction was the Occupy Wall Street moment. And that was when Bernie Sanders rose to prominence, and the big critique was of so-called late-stage capitalism. And that was what was really going on and leading the dialogue on the left, was that the billionaires and the Wall Street guys had ruined the country and something needed to change. And that was the moment when the universities suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of left-wing discourse. Previously, academics had been pretty much leftists in good standing. You know, the liberal arts academies were thought of as these places where free inquiry and discourse and anti-fascism could flourish because they had a kind of countercultural, or at least open-minded sort of reputation. And suddenly now the image of the ivory tower and the groves of academe turned into something ugly for the left, something that could emblematize everything that they were upset about in the country, like excesses of wealth and pointless expenditures on a very small percentage of self-styled aristocrats while others languished in poverty. And that repositioning of the universities as enemies of leftism created the incentive and the necessity for them to find some new kind of leftist crusade that academics could lead, so they could come back into the front of the vanguard. And that's what wokeness did, among other things, for the professoriate, is it created a new rubric where academic jargon and obscure grievance studies and endless struggle sessions where disciplines and reading lists were culled and purged and rewritten and decolonized could become the focus and the center of attention. And then, as he points out about Bates, you know, individual liberal arts colleges could position themselves as frontrunners of justice all of a sudden, no longer part of the enemy class, but back again in the good graces of the radicals. And so this was, among other things, like a strategic move that these places pulled. And it was distracting from the fact that they weren't actually making meaningful changes in those other economic realms. And the university remains a fundamentally aristocratic and elitist enterprise. So anyway, all of that is an argument that that Tyler Austin Harper makes very well in this piece from his own point of view to people who will share that point of view and therefore find it more persuasive than when guys like us go off and rail about radicalism and tenured radicals and so on and so forth. Like, I think that part in and of itself, while it may not satisfy us on the right as much, makes this piece a very effective and meaningful cultural watershed. I do think, Ryan, you wanted to raise the question, and I'm really interested to discuss with you, will this spur meaningful change? And then also, you know, if it doesn't spur meaningful change, will the universities suffer for it? Or is it possible for places like Bates and indeed Princeton and Harvard and Yale to just ignore all of this and go on twiddling their thumbs and indulging in racial grievance?
I listened to the podcast last week, and I wanted to take issue with one thing that Mike Sabo said, which is what you're alluding to. But first, I just want to flag two instances in this piece to remind people of the depth of the insanity in the modern left-wing academy, and which it has not gone away. Bates ends up abandoning this, or at least putting off this huge overhaul plan, especially as in light of Trump's reelection the last year and a half, as perhaps ill-advised in many ways. But the spirit is still there, and it's captured by a couple of incidences that Harper recounts, which we should not leave unmentioned. One of which was, at some point, one of his colleagues said, that a few white students, including one of his students, just basically tried to have a black person lynched, and he thought, "Oh, I'm sorry, what?" When he dug into it,
unbelievable.
He dug into it, and it turned out that some of most of the Bates students are kind of left wing, kind of crunchy types, especially the kids attracted to his sort of ecologically inflected humanities stuff that he worked on. And he knew one of these students, and he thought, that doesn't sound right. I mean, a lynching, that's an insane charge. What are you talking about? And a few of these white students had a dispute with their black roommate or housemate, and things had escalated somehow, and they had asked him to leave the residence, and they said they would call the police if he tried to get back in, saying that he was trying to harass them. This the colleague concluded was the weaponization of the criminal justice system. Because obviously, if the police were called about a student at very liberal, artsy, and pretty well-off Bates College,
that it would be fatal. Exactly, there would be a fatal altercation,
and just shoot him, which struck Harper as completely absurd. And this led to a subsequent musings by some of his colleagues that some of the or related musings by his colleagues that some of the establishments in Lewiston ought to be avoided because they were filled with bigots and would be unsafe for him, a person of color. And he thought, well, what do you mean by that? And the extent of the accusation of one business in particular amounted to the fact that a black student had worked there and had not had a great experience as an employee. So these are two of his examples of what seemed to him to be an insane inflation of minor incidences that normally happen between employer and employee or between roommates, and inflecting them with this grand narrative of racial oppression. And it just did not pass the smell test for him. And I just, one last thought on this. I wonder what you think of this, Spencer, and we'll get to Sabo's comment about higher ed. I think to answer your other question, the Bateses of the world will probably survive. I mean, it's a second tier liberal arts college. The coming demographic collapse or the coming cliff of demography for a lot of these liberal arts colleges is going to kill many of them, but I suspect the couple of top tiers of them will survive. I think Bates will be among them. Harvard and the Ivies, of course, will survive indefinitely, alas. But this seems to me to just put a bow on all of this. Our colleague Chris Caldwell likes to talk about the Civil Rights Revolution and the 64 Act, et cetera. One of the problems with it is it was sold to the American people as a discrete solution to a very discrete problem. That is to say, years of segregation after the collapse of Reconstruction in the South in the century after it, and finally reckoning with that. So this was a discrete solution to an egregious problem of injustice, and was sold to the American people as such, but it quickly morphed into a much more comprehensive reordering of American constitutionalism, well outside the realm of Black Americans and their experience in segregation and the hangovers from that persisted into mid-century America. It seems to me there's this cultural academic equivalent that has taken place, which is perhaps in the 60s and 70s, there were a few reasonable complaints about a certain type of faculty at what were long kind of waspy white institutions about insufficient attention being paid to the full story of American politics. But then it was quickly hijacked and turned into a transformational and revolutionary reordering of the structure of knowledge itself, how it's conveyed, how we understand things. It goes to epistemology and ontology. It's not just a adjustment to the curriculum after perhaps a too dominant rah-rah version of American history, but this wholesale reordering of what education is, how we learn, and how we move in the world along kind of Marxist, communist, race communist lines. I just leave that there hanging in the air. It's the analogy struck me as somewhat apt. And while we deal with, I think, long overdue critiques of the constitutional and institutional sides of the Civil Rights Revolution and its radicalization, the Academy is now going through some of the stuff as well. I wanted to bring up Mike Sabo's comment in the last podcast that in light of the Professor Arday business and plagiarism out of Cambridge and his defenestration, which is a good thing, for being a complete fraud. And then you and Mike brought up the Claudine Gay incident at Harvard. Mike was led to say, yes, Spencer, you're right. This problem will have to be solved by the left. A thing that you just said about these topics we've been discussing. It's an intra-left thing that they're going to have to get right. And then Mike said, and if they don't, Harvard and the other elite institutions will become jokes to the rest of America. Their prestige will collapse. And my thought when I was listening was, oh, Sabo, if only it were going to be so.
That it were true?
Yeah, Claudine Gay and Cambridge and their recent controversy. I think these are blips for now. I mean, they are still the prestige institutions in the higher education ecosystem that spans the Atlantic Ocean. None of these institutions are going anywhere anytime soon. Perhaps they've been exposed as a bit fraudulent in some respects, but you still have the elites of the world wanting to go to all these institutions. The value of these degrees continue to persist. They are still some of the few keys to elite American and Western perches, including not just in academia or politics, but in finance and consulting. And other very lucrative careers, legal, academic, or legal, medical, or whatever. So I don't think their collapse in prestige is imminent, but perhaps some cracks are starting to show. The contrast I offered when we were offline before this is, Hillsdale, my alma mater, is not yet really seen as the Harvard of the right. Perhaps it is in certain circles, but in the wider American public consciousness, most people still have not heard of Hillsdale, even though when you talk to a lot of people on the right in places like Washington, D.C., they say, yeah, elite positions in this administration and around the government are increasingly dominated by a certain cohort of impressive Hillsdale alum. But Hillsdale now can boast really only one. This is changing. I'm happy to admit, and I'm happy that it's happening. But really, for now, their biggest success in making inroads into elite academic institutions is that they now can boast a tenure-track faculty member at Yale Law School, which is not nothing, a Hillsdale grad. But we're a long way from the not only the replacement, but really at a minimum, a bit of a recalibration of the avenues to success offered by American higher ed. And unfortunately, Hillsdale is not replacing Harvard anytime soon.
I take that point. I think, part of the utility of figures like Jason Arday or Claudine Gay for prestige institutions is that when they attain kind of pariah status, when they get blown up into these news stories, the institution, if it chooses, can then, dismiss that faculty member. They can dismiss Jason Arday, call for his resignation, conduct an internal review, and then pretend like, oh, this was the one bad apple that got in. This was our mistake, and now everything is structurally fine, right? And the point that conservatives are making about this is no, these are extremely over the top, indicative examples of something that is going on at every level of disciplines like sociology. And until you face up to that, you won't have any kind of real meaningful change. So I think that there's definitely a possibility, which we did talk about last week, that's how this will go. The question that you raise in response to Mike is, if they do that, if these elite institutions do that, will they hemorrhage students? Will they become less prestigious and so forth? And I do think, the power and the tenacity of prestige and brand recognition is not to be underestimated. I've experienced it myself. I tell a story a lot that, I'm one of these examples of a product of an Ivy League and a product of Oxford who then has turned around and said there's a real problem with these institutions, and they have become kind of shadows of their former selves. And so I go on shows a lot and I talk about this sort of thing. And I remember very vividly once being in the kind of green room of a show to talk about this topic and hearing the host railing against academic corruption at the Ivy Leagues and just talking about how all of these places that were once great, they've totally betrayed their cause and so on and so forth. And then so help me, and I won't name her because she was a perfectly nice lady and I don't want to shame this person, but she then turned around from that rant and said, my next guest is Spencer Klavan. He went to Yale and then he did his degree at Oxford. And it was like, okay, but this is the problem, right? The problem is that those names attach to resumes with this incredible weight still, even as they start to become less and less of what we know them to be. All I'll say to add as a grace note, I mean, I do think you're right, Ryan. It'll take a long time, if at all, to kind of like right this ship. And I do hope that the prestige institutions and academies will reform. There's a part of the Tyler Austin Harper piece that has not gotten as much play that I think is really telling and interesting, which is that he takes a year of academic leave. I think it takes a sabbatical. And this is just after the end of 2022 when ChatGPT comes out for the first time, makes its big splash. I think it was GPT 3.5 in November of 2022. And he takes, I guess it must have been the calendar year of 2023 off. And so he's watching Bates from afar on his sabbatical. And he says, everybody was freaking out about AI cheating because that was the news story in the academy, that suddenly these chatbots were making it possible for students to circumvent our essay assignments and they never read anything anymore and literacy is declining and so forth. But nobody seemed to have much willpower to do anything about it. And I think that is a key to something important, which is that these racial purges and these orgies of self-recrimination created a situation where no top-tier professor could make a robust, full-throated defense of the humanities. Because in the age of AI, when a machine can do your writing for you and summarize the books for you, a lot of the economic utility goes out of liberal arts degrees. You can no longer say, well, this is going to train you in critical thinking or what have you. It will do that, but the value of that becomes less and less apparent as these tools become more and more powerful. And so the only really effective defense of the humanities in those conditions is we read and write great books because they enrich our souls, and they enrich our souls because they were written by minds of surpassing wisdom and virtue. And that is exactly what so many professors just spent 5 to 10 years arguing against. They just spent all this time arguing themselves out of a job, arguing that their job shouldn't exist, that the things that we teach are actually terrible and racist and written by bad people, and we should feel bad for teaching them, and we need to reconsider and deconstruct and maybe even just close up shop altogether. And now they're in the awkward position of having to turn around and say, oh no, look at this terrible crisis. AI is destroying the humanities. And everyone's like, well, wait, you just told us the humanities are evil. Why should we be upset about that? And it's really, really hard now for these people to mount a cogent defense of the humanities, qua the humanities, as an ennobling, virtuous, and valuable thing that passes on a civilizational tradition. So I don't think that all of this will mean places where wokeness has taken over become laughingstocks to the rest of the country overnight. But I do think that those places will suffer much, much more from the AI revolution and find themselves in a much worse position to argue their case to students than places like Hillsdale and UATX and other, what I've called the Renegade Academy, these places where kind of great books are still taught. You know, I think that those places have a huge advantage now with students to actually persuade them that there's a reason they should be doing this painful and difficult work to master their disciplines. So that, I think, will have a very profound effect on which sorts of places endure and remain as places where you would go to get an actual decent education. How fast the prestige will change and change hands as a result of that is, I think, more of an open question. But I do think the AI thing is an accelerant to some extent.
Yeah, I think you and I, Mike too, for that matter. I mean, our proposition is that you and I have argued it publicly as well as in speeches and articles, as well as on the podcast, that it will be interesting to watch the extent to which the true master, the true wise and humane and well-educated masters of AI in the future are going to be, we suspect, disproportionately from places that still take great ideas and great books seriously, the people who will weather the AI storm, at least in a certain segment of white-collar knowledge work, for lack of a better term, will be those who are still well-educated in the old sense, because people who can't think because they've never read, because all of their work is done by chatbots, or all of their queries are now directed to chatbots rather than the old way of learning and becoming wise and experienced, at least in the ingestion of and contemplation of the great minds of the past. That's becoming a smaller and smaller minority of people, but precisely those qualities of mind and soul that will be needed to navigate the AI future are going to be on shorter and shorter supply in our institutions. Some of our long storied and high credentialed and respectable institutions, because they, as you just eloquently put it, they'll really have no way to defend the older way of doing learning because they've been undermining it for decades on different grounds. So I'm hopeful in that sense, and maybe Sabo's prediction will be more true than I hope. It certainly ought to be true. These places ought to lose the sheen of their reputation more quickly than they have been in recent years. And perhaps the AI revolution, in ways that we can't quite anticipate yet, will help that process, as the value of people well-educated becomes increasingly apparent, as I said, for a certain segment of the economy. It's a small segment of it, but it's where we draw our elites from, and have drawn our elites from, and I don't think that's going to change. So maybe the AI revolution will help us in this regard. And if it does, it will be one ways in which it's a good thing rather than a Orwellian or dystopian thing. Fun to watch. Let's hope it goes better rather than worse, and we'll keep talking about it. Well, that's all the time we have for it this week. Thank you all once again for listening to the American Mind podcast or watching it. If you want to find out more about our work, go to www.claremont.org. If you'd like to support it, claremont.org/donate. Go check out the Claremont Review Books at claremontreviewbooks.com and American Mind at americanmind.org. Please share the podcast and vidcast, rate it well, spread the wealth around. And then go check out, if you haven't already, claremontinstitute.substack.com, where we offer more stuff on our Digital Plus platform, more CRB stuff, and a weekly 20-minute segment where Spencer and I talk about some other topic and dive a little deeper. And also, never miss the latest out of our DC Center for the American Way of Life, dc.claremont.org. We have a few to celebrate America 250. We have a few provocations coming up in the coming months, which will be interesting to all of you. They will be housed at dc.claremont.org and broadcast on our normal email lists. So if you're not a member of one of those, sign up. And finally, thanks to the production and engineering one-man show, Ryan Gannon, and we will talk to you all next week.